Many people have met their end in unexpected places, and oddly enough, I may soon join their ranks. As a historian, there's a certain irony in thinking that my life could end in such a mundane place as a bathroom. To be fair, I might not be dying at all. I just feel like I've had a stroke in the restroom of my favorite pub by the harbor. My head's throbbing intensely. Still, there are worse ways to go. I've just enjoyed a satisfying meal and a pint of my favorite ale. Some men might consider it a pretty decent way to bow out. What makes the situation even more unbearable is that I overheard someone talking about how great things are with my wife, Lena. He went on about her perfect chest, how responsive she is, how she's an amazing kisser, and the pleasure she gives. Of course, after 32 years of marriage, I knew all of that. But I could have lived my whole life without hearing someone else describe it. What really stung was when he mentioned how great it was with her from behind. That was something she hadn't done with me in years, citing that it was degrading and painful for her knees. Apparently, it doesn't hurt when she's with a much younger man. A man I used to teach, no less. I might just pull through this. And if I do, there will be consequences for what I've learned. I don't usually go to the pub alone. Most of the time, I go with friends or with Lena. But that night, she was staying with her parents, so I figured I'd grab a meal at the pub instead of cooking for myself. Steak and potatoes for anyone who's curious. I've been a history teacher at the local high school in North Yorkshire for over 30 years now. I've even taught the children of some of my former students. It won't be long before I'm teaching their grandkids, I'm sure. I spotted Ben Mortimer and Kieran Yates at the bar, leaning against it like they didn't have a care in the world. It didn't take me long to figure out that it had been about 3 years since they graduated from my classroom. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It meant they were old enough to drink now, officially adults. It felt like just yesterday they were causing trouble in the back of my history class, always thinking they were cleverer than they really were. After finishing my meal, I decided to walk over to them, curious about how they were getting along with life after school. Turns out, both of them had ended up at the same cookie factory where Lena works. While they're stuck on the production line, churning out endless trays of biscuits, Lena's the secretary for the managing director. When I asked if they knew her, Kieran couldn't hold back a snicker, hiding his amusement behind his pint. It immediately set off a warning bell in my head. Ben, though, was the one to answer, playing it cool. He said he'd crossed paths with her a few times, mostly when he had to report to the boss. "She's a pleasant woman," he said with a grin that made my stomach turn a little. There was something off about how he said it, but at the time I didn't push it. I had no idea what was really going on beneath the surface. We were having a pretty good time, chatting and laughing over our drinks, so I decided to treat both Ben and Kieran to another round. It felt like a decent thing to do, considering they were former students of mine, and I enjoyed hearing what they were up to now. Eventually, though, it was time to call it a night, so I said my goodbyes and headed toward the bathroom before making my way out. I had just settled onto the toilet when I heard the door swing open, and 2 voices followed behind it. I quickly recognized the voices as Ben and Kieran, and I froze in place as they continued their conversation. "I don't know how you're so relaxed about this, mate," Kieran said, sounding more than a little baffled. "Mr. Shaw's such a great guy. He just bought us both a pint. He's easily the best teacher I ever had. I couldn't stand history until he came along. How can you just sit there talking to him, knowing what you've been doing with his wife?" Ben's reply was casual, as if what he was saying wasn't completely outrageous. I know, he said. "I think he's a great guy, too. That's the whole point. I'm not doing anything to hurt him. I really like Mr. Shaw, but I just happen to like Lena even more. You've seen her, Kay. You've seen her, Kieran. She's amazing," Ben continued, his voice practically dripping with smugness. "I mean, just look at her chest alone. It's unreal. And she's not just good to look at, man. She's a lot of fun to be with, too. But here's the thing. I'm not actually hurting anyone, am I? I'm doing him a favor, if you think about it. It's not like it's my fault he can't connect with her anymore. I'm just stepping in where he can't, filling the gap. And you know what? If it wasn't me, it'd be someone else for sure. I'm not wrecking their marriage. Lena's 53. She's not going to leave him for someone like me. And trust me, I'm not about to run off with her either. It's better this way. Better me than some older guy who could really mess things up." Kieran didn't seem as convinced as Ben, though he tried to play along. "Still, mate, it's wrong, isn't it? You're messing around with a married woman. And then you're sitting there, drinking with her husband like it's all normal. They kept chatting, but honestly, I couldn't focus on what came next. My heart was pounding, not from the stroke, but from the sheer shock of it all. My chest felt tight, like I was being crushed under the weight of what I was hearing. Ben Mortimer, the same kid I'd taught history to, was not only spending time with my wife, but actually bragging about it like he was doing me some sort of service. He saw himself as a stand-in for me, like I'd become incapable of being a real husband, and he was just stepping up to the plate. The arrogance of it was staggering. Sure, Lena and I had our issues, but I never in my worst nightmares thought I'd be the guy whose wife was sneaking around with someone half her age, let alone someone I once had in my own classroom. Just when I thought I couldn't be more furious, Ben and Kieran started talking about my collection. Yes, my personal collection of military memorabilia, as if it were some sort of joke. They sounded like kids again, getting all excited about the stuff in my office, thrilled by both that and apparently my wife. Ben said something that made my skin crawl. "The thing with Mrs. Shaw," he said, "it's just companionship, nothing more. Fantastic companionship, but that's all it is." He made it sound so casual, like it was no big deal, as if the fact that he was sneaking around with my wife was just part of some casual arrangement, like an extra bit of entertainment on the side. They went on for a bit longer, still talking about Lena in a way that made me sick to my stomach, but eventually they left. By that point, the tingling in my arm was getting worse. I could feel something was really wrong, but I wasn't sure if it was just the anger making me feel that way or if the stroke was hitting me harder. I tried to focus, tried to move, but everything felt heavy. Luckily, not long after Ben and Kieran left, someone else walked into the bathroom. I managed to get their attention somehow, though I'm not sure if the words I was saying made any sense at all. In my head, I thought I was telling them to call an ambulance, but I doubt it came out clearly. Fortunately, they understood that I wasn't just some drunk guy passed out in the bathroom, and they called for help. Now here I am in the hospital, lying back on this uncomfortable pillow, with my thoughts running wild. All I could do was think about Lena and our life together. Lena and I have been married for 32 years, which is a long time to build a life with someone. We tied the knot on her 21st birthday, and from the start, there were no kids. I had always imagined having children, a family to raise, but that was something Lena wasn't interested in. At first, that was a tough pill to swallow, but in the end, I wanted Lena more than I wanted to be a father. She became my priority. She was enough for me, always enough. I thought I was enough for her, too. I thought that for a long time, but eventually I stopped thinking that way. Not having kids meant we had a kind of freedom other couples didn't. While our friends were busy raising their families and running to soccer games or school plays, we could travel on a whim, do whatever we wanted, whenever we wanted. It gave us flexibility and, frankly, more disposable income to enjoy our lives. We weren't rich, but we managed well enough. We paid off the sterling years ago, and our house, though not big, suited the two of us perfectly. We didn't even need the extra bedrooms, honestly. One of them, Lena, turned into her walk-in closet, filled with all her beautiful clothes. She had a great sense of style and took a lot of pride in how she looked. I loved that about her, how she enjoyed looking good and carrying herself with confidence. The other room became my sanctuary, my home office. It was where I kept my military memorabilia and maps, where I could spend hours getting lost in history. Lena was happy to have my collection stored there, away from the rest of the house, and I was content with my little corner. My love for history has been a lifelong passion, and my collection of military maps, memorabilia, and other artifacts was something I was deeply proud of. I kept it all tucked away in my office, where I could enjoy it without intruding on the rest of the house. It might sound like a bit of an eccentric hobby, but I swear it wasn't as overwhelming as you'd think. Most of the items in my collection were actually used in my lessons at school. They were tools of the trade, visual aids to help make history come alive for my students. Lena was always relieved that I kept all my stuff contained to that one room, where it didn't clutter up the rest of our living space. She had her closet, and I had my office. It worked out well for both of us. I took pride in being a good teacher, even if my subject wasn't the most exciting for most kids. I knew my passion for history wasn't something many people shared, especially teenagers who would rather do anything than sit through a history lesson. But my goal was to make it engaging and relevant to their lives, to bring the past to life in a way they could relate to. To some extent, I think I succeeded. I tried to make my classes as interesting as I could. I wasn't one to boast, But the truth is, I was popular with my students. That popularity sometimes caused a little professional jealousy among my colleagues, but I never let it bother me too much. At the end of the day, what mattered to me was that my students were learning, even if they didn't all fall in love with history the way I had. If they liked me more than the subject itself, that was fine. I knew they were still absorbing the material. Physically, I'm pretty average, nothing special. I've always tried to keep myself in decent shape, but nothing to write home about. Lena, though, she was always beautiful to me, right from the start. When we were young, she was just an ordinary girl, but over the years, she aged so gracefully. She had this natural beauty that only seemed to grow with time. One thing that never changed, though, was her chest. Lena always had a large bust, and that's something most people, especially men, couldn't help but notice. When we first met, she actually complimented me, saying I was one of the few men who looked her in the eyes when we talked. Most guys were too busy staring at her chest. Of course, what she didn't know was that I had perfected the art of sneaking glances when she wasn't looking. Every time she turned her head, I'd steal a quick look. It was almost like a game. I was fascinated by her from the very moment I laid eyes on her, 34 years ago. I adored her, every part of her. So, you can imagine how hearing Ben and Kieran mock her in the bathroom, talking about her chest like it was some kind of joke, made my blood boil. They weren't just objectifying her. They were laughing at her, at us, at our entire marriage. That angered me more than I could possibly put into words. My heart raced, and I had to remind myself to take some deep breaths. I needed to calm down, to keep my blood pressure in check, but it wasn't easy with the rage bubbling inside me. Lena and I were always faithful to each other. At least I know I was. From the day we met, she was the only woman I'd ever been with. I was a virgin when we got together, and that never bothered me. In fact, it felt special that she was the only one. Our relationship was solid, and we had a good thing going. Unlike a lot of couples, we managed to keep the same energy and passion well into our 30s and even our 40s. We both had strong desires, and since we didn't have children, there were fewer distractions. We lived like newlyweds for years, keeping things exciting and fresh. We weren't afraid to experiment, and we found ways to keep each other interested. Role-playing, trying out new things, we always found ways to keep the spark alive. That was until everything changed when Lena hit 40. Menopause struck, and it hit her hard. She didn't take it well, and I didn't know how to help her through it. Almost overnight, our love life came to a screeching halt. It wasn't just the physical side that stopped. Suddenly, I wasn't even allowed to touch her. If I reached over to cuddle her at night, she'd accuse me of only wanting one thing. And God forbid I actually suggest making love. That made me a heartless bastard in her eyes. Didn't I understand what she was going through? Didn't I care about her feelings? The truth was I didn't fully understand. I had no clue what menopause felt like, but I still tried my best to support her. I loved her, and I didn't want to make things harder on her. But it wasn't easy, and I began to feel more and more isolated. Our once active and passionate love life turned into a dead zone practically overnight. For 2 long years, there was no intimacy, nothing at all. The woman who had once been so eager to be close now seemed repelled by any kind of physical touch. It wasn't easy for me. After months of feeling rejected and frustrated, I tried to offer a solution. I suggested putting a bed in my office. Honestly, I thought it was a reasonable idea. I figured she'd appreciate having the bedroom to herself, where she could control the temperature and wouldn't have to worry about me trying to initiate anything. In some selfish way, I thought it would give me a little space too. It wasn't just the visual torture of seeing her getting dressed or undressed and knowing I couldn't do anything. It was also the scent of her, lying next to me every night. It was agonizing, being so close and yet so far from her. On top of that, I was freezing. She kept the window wide open all winter long because she was always overheated, and I was left shivering under the blankets. So, I thought moving to another room would give us both some relief. But instead of appreciating the suggestion, she acted like I'd suggested abandoning her. In her eyes, I wasn't just looking for space. I was rejecting her, showing her that I didn't care. I was the villain, cold and heartless. She couldn't see that I was trying to help both of us. So I stayed. I stayed in our bedroom, freezing in the dead of winter, frustrated beyond belief, but still feeling like I was doing the right thing by sticking with her. In the midst of everything, I held on to the thought that at least, in my difficult life, I was still being a supportive husband. Then, just when I had started to accept our new reality, Lena's desire came back with a vengeance. It was like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. By the time she turned 52, the so-called menopause fairy decided to pack up and move on to someone else, leaving Lena with a few more curves, which, frankly, I thought suited her beautifully, and a renewed energy for intimacy. You'd think this would have been a happy turning point for us, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. While Lena was getting her spark back, I was finding myself falling behind. Somewhere along the line, I had lost the ability to perform, though my desire was still very much alive. At first, I thought maybe it was just because we hadn't been active for so long. But after a few months, it became clear that it wasn't just a matter of getting back into the swing of things. No, this was something more serious. Erectile dysfunction, plain and simple. I still remember how embarrassed I felt walking into the doctor's office to ask for help. My doctor at the time was a young guy, probably fresh out of medical school, and he didn't have a single ounce of empathy in him. He brushed off my concerns with clinical indifference like I was wasting his time. "It's just a side effect of your blood pressure medication," he said, as if that explained everything. "You'll have to live with it." That was it. No advice, no reassurance, nothing to make me feel any less humiliated. I left the office feeling devastated. After the initial shock wore off, I realized I had two choices. I could give up on making love altogether, or I could figure out how to embrace a new way of being intimate with my wife. If there was one thing I had learned over those long, lonely years without intimacy, it was how much I missed being close to Lena. I wasn't about to let that slip away again. So, I made a choice. My pleasure would come from hers. I still had hands, a mouth. There were other ways to make her happy, and I was determined to find them. And I did. We found our rhythm again, though it was different from before. They say the brain is the biggest sexual organ, and maybe that's true because we made love 2, sometimes 3 times a week. Lena seemed satisfied, and I was proud that I could still bring her so much joy. My confidence started to come back. I still couldn't perform like I used to, but I learned to adapt. As for my own needs, I turned to the help of aides to fill the gap, and I didn't mind as long as they were part of our time together. I'll admit it was a bit of a pride thing, but I needed to feel like they were an extension of me. Lena had her own aides for when she was alone, and that was fine too. For a while, I thought we had found a good balance. I was still satisfying her, and in turn, I rediscovered the simple joys of being hugged, kissed, and caressed. I was cherished again, and Lena still seemed to want me, even if things weren't exactly the way they used to be. I thought that was enough. I was wrong. Once I arrived at the hospital, they quickly determined that I'd had an ischemic stroke. The doctors acted fast, prescribing a combination of medications to help prevent any further damage and to reduce the risk of a second stroke. Timing, they told me, was everything in a situation like this. I was lucky they had caught it in time. Slowly, I began to regain my voice, though at first, forming the right words was difficult. My thoughts were clear, but getting them out took effort, like my mind and mouth weren't quite in sync yet. A kind nurse named Emily kept me updated on everything, explaining the steps they were taking and keeping an eye on my progress. She was the one who informed me that they had contacted Lena, though she was still a couple of hours away. I remember the surge of panic and anger that rose inside me at the thought of seeing her. Somehow, through the slurred speech, I managed to make it clear to Emily that I absolutely did not want to see my wife. I think she initially assumed my outburst was just part of my condition until she noticed how dramatically my blood pressure spiked. That's when I asked her to call my sister, Ruth, instead. She was local, lived just a few miles away, and I knew she would get here much faster than Lena. I also knew Ruth would know exactly how to handle this situation. She had always been the strong one, the protector in the family. Standing at 6 feet tall, with size 9 shoes to match, Ruth had always been a force to be reckoned with, even when we were kids. Whenever I found myself in trouble, she was always there, ready to defend me, and I knew now would be no different. It felt like no time had passed at all from the moment they called her, and there she was walking into my room, Nurse Emily, a bit taken aback, even asked if she had flown in. Ruth just grinned and said, "Only on a motorcycle, darling. It's a Kawasaki, and when I need it, it flies." With that, she rushed over to me and gave me one of her bone-crushing hugs, her usual tough exterior cracking just a little as she wiped away a tear from her cheek. "You big, foolish rascal," she said, trying to sound stern. "You scared me half to death. Don't you ever do that to me again. If you die on me, I'll come up there and confront you myself." We all laughed at that, even Nurse Emily. It was a relief to laugh after everything that had happened. Once things settled, I told Ruth about what I had overheard in the pub bathroom, every word of it. I didn't care if Nurse Emily overheard. It felt good to finally share it with someone who would understand. Ruth, always the protector, immediately said, "I'll make sure she doesn't get in to see you. You need to stay calm, and that's not going to happen if she shows up." Emily even chimed in, suggesting that I might want to list Ruth as my next of kin on the hospital forms. Apparently, it wasn't a legal requirement to list a spouse. "Well, I am his closest blood relative," Ruth said matter-of-factly. "We're all each other has now." And she wasn't wrong. We'd been through so much together, and now it seemed like she was the only person I could truly count on. I later found out that Lena had caused quite a scene when she was told I didn't want to see her. Of course, she didn't understand why. No one had explained the details to her, and I could only imagine how confused and upset she must have been. I don't blame her for that. I knew, deep down, she was probably genuinely worried about me. Despite everything, I was certain she still loved me in her own way, and her concern for my health was likely real. But as much as I understood her worry, I couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of her punishment. I knew we couldn't avoid a conversation forever. After 32 years of marriage, there was no way to walk away without at least talking things through, no matter how angry I was. But I also knew, without a doubt, that our marriage was over. She had made a fool of me, humiliated me, but I wasn't going to be the kind of man who accepted that knowingly. She had betrayed me, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. At some point during all this, Lena encountered Ruth, who had been waiting for her in the hospital parking lot. I had asked Ruth to tell Lena just enough to give her a sense of why I didn't want to see her, but nothing more. Ruth, being her usual direct self, did just that. After Lena had finished crying and calmed down enough to ask why I didn't want to see her, Ruth simply looked her in the eye and said, "You almost killed my brother with your antics. You're a filthy creature, and I don't want to talk to you anymore." And with that, Ruth lowered the visor on her helmet and sped off into the night, leaving Lena standing there in the parking lot, stunned. Once I was discharged from the hospital, I went to stay with Ruth for a while. She still lives in the old bungalow we grew up in, Mom's place. After Mom passed away, Ruth bought out my share of the house, and it's been her home ever since. It was comforting to be there, surrounded by old memories and knowing Ruth would take care of me. The doctor sent me home with a long list of rehabilitation instructions. Although I had recovered enough to be discharged, I still had a long way to go. There would be weeks, maybe months, of physical therapy ahead of me, and I'd need support during the recovery process. Ruth offered to help as much as she could, but after only one day at her house, I realized I couldn't avoid it any longer. I needed to face Lena. I needed to hear what she had to say. So, I asked Ruth to invite her over. It was time to have the conversation I had been dreading, the one that would decide what happened next. I like to tell myself that maybe, deep down, there was a part of me that could forgive her. After all, we had spent so many years together. I had loved her for such a long time, and in some strange way, I still did. Or maybe I just loved the version of her that I thought she was, the woman I'd built up in my mind over 3 decades of marriage. But as much as I wanted to believe forgiveness was possible, I knew better. I'm a Yorkshireman, stubborn to the core, and my male pride and ego wouldn't let me forgive her, even if I tried. I needed to be able to look at myself in the mirror with a shred of dignity. At that moment, I couldn't. I knew I wouldn't be able to until I confronted her. Before Lena arrived, I asked Ruth to make herself scarce. She nodded, disappeared on her bike, helmet and all, leaving the front door slightly ajar so Lena could walk right in. When Lena arrived, I was surprised by how bad she looked, worse than I expected. Her eyes were puffy and red from crying, and it didn't look like she had slept in days. She seemed fragile in a way I hadn't seen before. The moment she stepped through the door, her emotions hit hard. "Arthur," she said, her voice wavering, "I don't know whether to kiss you or slap you. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? If you thought you were sparing me emotional pain by refusing to see me, you were wrong. I can't eat. I can't sleep." Her words spilled out, but I could see where this was going. She was making it all about her. I responded flatly, "So, it's all about how this affects you, Lena?" She shook her head quickly, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, it's not like that. I just don't understand why you're being so cruel." "You know why?" I shot back, my patience wearing thin. "Think about it. I know you've been mulling over what Ruth said to you. What could you have done that hurt me so much that I ended up in the hospital? What did you do that made Ruth refuse to talk to you?" I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights. Then I gave her the final clue. "Ben Mortimer." I said, the name hanging in the air like a guillotine. To her credit, she flinched when I said it. At least she had enough shame left to do that. She quickly tried to gather herself. "What about him? He's just a silly boy from work." "A silly boy you've been spending a lot of time with," I said, my voice calm but edged with anger. "How did you think I wouldn't find out?" "I was careful," she said, almost too quickly, betraying her guilt. "Well, you weren't careful enough," I snapped. "Especially when you're spending time with someone so immature that he brags about it to his friend." "I overheard him and Kieran talking about you in the pub bathroom. I heard everything. How he loves your big old chest. How great a lover you are." The look of horror on her face was satisfying in a twisted way. She knew she was caught, and there was no escape. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that," she whispered. "It must have been awful for you." "It was bad enough to land me in the hospital," I said, the words heavy with finality. She tried to reason with me. "Darling, you shouldn't have let it upset you. It's nothing. He means nothing. He's nothing to me, to us. I don't have any feelings for him. Except for desire," I said bitterly. She took a deep breath and nodded slightly. "Yes, except for desire. He's just like a companion, that's all. You've been satisfying me in your way, and you've done a good job of it. But there was something missing, and when I had the chance to have a real companion made of flesh and blood, not just a cold piece of plastic, I couldn't resist. Couldn't resist? Or wouldn't?" I shot back, my voice harsher than I intended, but I didn't care. "You left me without intimacy for 2 years, Lena. 2 long years. Do you think I didn't have the same option? I could have gone out and found myself a real companion made of flesh and blood. Couldn't I?" She seemed taken aback by my bluntness, but quickly shifted the blame. "That wasn't my fault. It was menopause. You know that." At that moment, I felt something snap inside me. All the frustration and pain that had been building up for years boiling over. "Oh, it wasn't your fault? So it's all because you were sick? Isn't that what marriage is about, Lena? In sickness and in health, forsaking all others? Does that phrase ring a bell? Or does it only apply to me?" She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. "So, it's okay for me to be left unsatisfied, untouched, unloved for 2 years. But you? You couldn't handle it for a moment longer? My God, your selfishness is beyond belief." Her eyes widened as she took in the force of my words. I wasn't holding anything back now. "You want to know the real difference between us, Lena? You abandoned me. You left me without affection, without a single hug, a kiss, or any sign of love for 2 years. But I never stopped loving you. I stayed. I was right there by your side. Even when you discarded me, even when you made me feel like I didn't exist to you anymore. And now you've done it all over again." She turned her face away, unable to look at me. I continued, "Can you even begin to imagine how it felt to sit in that bathroom and listen to 2 guys laughing about you, talking about you like some street companion, discussing my most personal, private medical condition, mocking me because I can't connect anymore? And you're doing things with him, things you haven't done with me in years, in my own home, in my personal office. What did I do to deserve this kind of disrespect, Lena? All I ever did was love you." Her response was defensive, almost reflexive. "It wasn't like that, Arthur. You're twisting everything. I wasn't disrespecting you. I was just using him. It didn't mean anything. It didn't affect my love for you. It was separate. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Separate? So, no tenderness, no real intimacy? She nodded, confirming what I had suspected. Yes, exactly. It was just a physical act, just companionship. I made sure she was looking directly into my eyes before I spoke again. Lena, you're wrong. No real intimacy. You must be kidding yourself. Letting someone else into your life, into our marriage, that is probably the most intimate thing you could have done. What about kissing? I asked, my voice sharp. Did you kiss him? She scoffed, rolling her eyes like I was asking something ridiculous. You know, historically, companions never kissed their clients because it was considered too intimate, she said, trying to brush off the seriousness of my question. Are you trying to say that makes you less guilty, Lena? You really think that comparing yourself to a companion somehow makes this better? I shot back, incredulous. She looked away for a second, then turned back to me, defensiveness creeping into her tone. In my entire life, Arthur, I've only been with 2 men, him and you. Does that make me a companion in your eyes? I didn't soften. Is that supposed to make me feel better, Lena? 2 men or 20? It doesn't change the fact that you betrayed me. I paused for a moment before continuing. I'm not calling you a companion, no. But right now, I have more respect for a companion than I do for you. Her face twisted with anger at that. Enough of this, she shouted, her frustration boiling over. You're behaving horribly, Arthur. You're starting to really piss me off. Now, go pack your things. You're coming home with me, and we need to put all of this nonsense behind us. It's time to get back to our normal life. I stared at her, amazed by how out of touch she was. Normal, I repeated, shaking my head. What do you consider normal, Lena? Is it normal for you to spend time with teenagers in our bed? Or is it normal for me to have a faithful, devoted wife? Because if you think the latter is still the case, I don't know what planet you're living on. You're being ridiculous, Arthur, she snapped back, clearly trying to dismiss my anger. You're coming home with me because you need me, and I need to take care of you. I can't stand it when you're not with me, and I know you need me too. I didn't waver. No, Lena, I'm not going home with you, and I definitely don't need you. I love you, I admitted, the words feeling like a bitter pill. I can't help that. I wish I didn't. But here's the truth. I don't need you anymore, and I certainly don't want you. She looked stunned, like she couldn't believe what I was saying. You can't be serious. Yes, Lena, I'm dead serious. You don't seem to grasp what your actions have done to me, to us, or to our marriage. The fact that you're not even taking this seriously says everything I need to know about where we stand. Our values, our needs, they're completely misaligned. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. What really shocks me is that you haven't even asked for forgiveness. And let me be honest with you. After all these years, you probably deserve that honesty. Even if you had thrown yourself at my feet and begged for forgiveness, I doubt it would have changed anything. But we'll never know, will we? I looked her in the eye, the truth settling between us like a stone. The truth is, you don't think you did anything wrong. You're just sorry I found out. You're not sorry for what you did. And that's why this marriage is over. That's why I'm divorcing you. Her silence told me everything. You took something incredibly valuable to me, our marriage, my trust, and shattered it without a second thought. I just can't give you what you need anymore. So, I'm setting you free. Go get all the companionship you want. And as for me, I'm freeing myself because being with you is clearly a danger to my health. That could have been the end of it. But, of course, life rarely wraps things up that neatly. Lena wasn't done yet. You're talking absolute nonsense, she snapped. There isn't going to be a divorce. You're coming home with me right now. I love you, and I need you. You can't just throw away 32 years of marriage over this. I can't believe how selfish you're being. Nothing? That's exactly the problem, Lena. I fired back. To you it was nothing, but to me, it was everything. The level of disrespect you've shown me, in my own home, no less, it's beyond belief. I stood up, feeling the finality of my words. And now, you have the nerve to call me selfish? No, Lena, I'm done. Now leave before you hurt me even more. Not long after Lena left, I heard the familiar sound of Ruth's bike roaring back into the garage. She didn't come into the house right away, so I headed out to the garage to fill her in on what had just gone down. She was crouched by her bike, tightening a screw on the rear license plate, a small smile on her face. "Don't ask," she said with a wink. "Just preparing a little gift for my favorite brother." I couldn't help but smirk. "Only for your brother?" She grinned. "Well, you'll always be my favorite." Then her tone shifted as she got to the point. "So, what did the former Mrs. Shaw have to say for herself? Did she come crawling back with a heartfelt apology?" "Not quite," I replied, shaking my head. "Yeah, didn't think so," Ruth said with a sigh. "She was always a smug brat, but you could never see it." She clapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, kid, onward and upward. Let's go inside, and I'll make us a cup of tea." A few days later, I was flipping through the local newspaper when something caught my eye. Ben Mortimer, 19 years old, had apparently taken a nasty tumble down a set of stairs in the old town. The stairs were steep, dark, and narrow, nestled between rows of Georgian terraces. They led straight down to the waterfront, and the area was known for being a popular route for drunks staggering home after a night out. Poor Ben had broken a leg, his collarbone, several ribs, and according to the report, he was covered in urine when they found him. There was even a photo of him in the paper. He looked awful. I couldn't help but smirk at the coincidence. "Isn't it lucky that this happened when I was with Lena?" I mused aloud. "Isn't it funny that the police haven't managed to find a single witness to the accident? A tall guy in motorcycle gear, perhaps?" I handed the paper over to Ruth with a knowing look. She just smiled, clearly amused. "No idea what you're talking about," she said with a wink, her smirk growing. "Thanks for the gift," I said, but she just chuckled and handed me something else. "Here's the real gift," she said, passing me a small box. Inside was a collection of World War I medals. "I thought you might appreciate these. Found them in a shop in the old town." Lena and I, of course, ended up divorcing. She resisted at first, almost like she couldn't believe I wouldn't just sweep her infidelity under the rug. It seemed like she never fully came to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to just accept what she did and move on. After we sold the house, we both got separate apartments on opposite sides of town. It was strange, but our paths hardly ever crossed after that. Life moved on, slowly but surely. I threw myself back into work, though I won't lie, the first Christmas alone was rough. I did my best to keep it together in front of others, but I couldn't quite shake the sadness. I suppose I drowned my sorrows a bit too much at the office Christmas party that year. One of the younger teachers, Jason, ended up driving me home. Somewhere along the way, I ended up telling him the whole story. Everything about Lena, the affair, the divorce. His reaction caught me off guard. Instead of pity, there was understanding. He reassured me that any man in my position would have done exactly what I did. That support meant more to me than he could have known. I eventually retired, still living on my own. Ruth and I stayed close, spending a lot of time together before she eventually packed up and moved to Greece for her own retirement. We still kept in touch and saw each other over the holidays, but with her gone, life became a bit quieter. A little dull, if I'm honest, though I kept busy with my love for history. When I turned 65, something unexpected happened. I got a new neighbor, Diana. We hit it off pretty quickly, becoming good friends, and then over time, something more. We fell in love, slowly but surely. The closeness between us grew naturally, and before long, we found ourselves sharing a bed, deepening our bond in ways I hadn't thought possible at my age. One night, early in this new phase of our relationship, something rather miraculous happened, literally. We didn't waste any time after that, and things between us only got stronger from there. After that miraculous night with Diana, I went to see a doctor, hoping for answers. The elderly doctor was shocked at how little support I had gotten before. With some changes to my medication, the issue that had weighed so heavily on my first marriage was finally resolved. By the time we went on our honeymoon, things were better than ever. That was 10 years ago. Diana and I are both 75 now, and we still love each other deeply. As far as I know, Lena never remarried. She moved away after I married Diana. The last time I saw her, bitterness and resentment had replaced the woman I once knew. It was right after Diana and I got engaged. Lena saw us at a cafe and couldn't resist making a nasty comment about my past struggles with intimacy. But Diana, Eversharp responded with a smirk, saying he just needed the right woman. This morning before breakfast, he certainly didn't have any problems. Lena was stunned and walked away without another word. Jealousy is a terrible thing, and I know it well. I once felt it, but now I found something real, a loving, faithful wife. Oddly enough, Ben Mortimer is now our mailman. He's nearly 40, and when he first saw me at the door, the guilt was written all over his face. He apologized, calling himself a foolish kid who didn't know better. He's married now and deeply ashamed of what he did. He told me that he had even confessed it to his wife when they were dating, and she almost didn't marry him because of it. He asked for my forgiveness, hoping one day I could see he had changed. I smiled and told him, "There's no need, Ben. It was 20 years ago. Ancient history." I shook his hand, something I never thought I'd be able to do. I also mentioned that my health issues were long behind me, which embarrassed him a bit, but we laughed it off. These days, we joke whenever I see him. I always tell him to be careful on the stairs.